The tremor in my hand wasn't the caffeine, though I'd probably had enough to wire a small city. It was the hum, a low, insistent thrum that seemed to vibrate not just through the floorboards of my studio, but directly into the marrow of my bones. I'd tried to paint it out to translate the invisible frequency into strokes of charcoal and washes of sepia, but the canvas remained stubbornly blank. My work, usually a frantic, desperate outpouring, had stalled. For weeks, the only thing I could conjure was a tightening in my chest, a phantom chill that no amount of studio heating could dispel. My phone, a rude interruption, startled me. I nearly dropped the brush. The screen glowed with an unfamiliar number, a regional code I hadn't seen in years. I let it ring, watching the vibrant red of the notification pulse against the gray screen, a stark contrast to the muted tones of my unstarted piece. It rang again and again. Eventually, I snatched it up, my voice rougher than I intended. "Dean here. Mr. Miller, this is an attorney calling on behalf of your late grandmother's estate." The voice was crisp, professional, devoid of any warmth. "I regret to inform you of her passing." Regret. I felt nothing but a hollow ache, a familiar emptiness that had been my constant companion since childhood. My grandmother had been a ghost to me for decades, a name whispered in hushed tones, a presence more felt than seen even when I was small. We'd been estranged since. We've enclosed the keys and necessary documents via courier. Sole heir, Blackwood Manor. It wasn't a windfall, it was a sentence. I knew that house. It was a place where nightmares took root and blossomed. A week later, the heavy brass key felt like a shard of ice in my palm. Blackwood Manor loomed at the end of a winding, overgrown driveway, a skeletal silhouette against a bruised sky. Victorian Gothic, they called it. I called it a tomb. The wrought iron gates, rusted shut for years, groaned in protest as I forced them open. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires was the only sound for miles. The house itself was a study in decay, peeling paint, warped shutters, ivy clawing its way up the brickwork like a desperate green hand. It smelled of damp earth, stagnant air, and something else, something ancient and faintly metallic, like old blood. I stepped out of my car, the biting wind whipping at my coat. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a small, desperate prayer. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak, was swollen in its frame. I had to put my shoulder into it, grunting as it finally yielded with a deep, shuddering groan that echoed through the empty foyer. Inside, the silence was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on my eardrums. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grime-caked windows, swirling like tiny, lost souls. The grand staircase, once magnificent, now sagged, its banister marred by years of neglect. It was just a house, an old, forgotten house. My shoes scuffed against the bare floorboards as I ventured deeper, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the vast emptiness. I passed a parlor filled with draped furniture, resembling ghostly figures, and a dining room where a chandelier hung precariously, missing half its crystals. My skin prickled. A specific kind of stillness pervaded the air, a familiar heaviness I'd only ever known once before in a house long buried in my memory. I found myself drawn to the back of the house, a subconscious pull towards something I couldn't name. A narrow, unlit corridor led to a heavy, unmarked door. My hand, clammy and trembling, reached for the knob. It turned with a dry click, and the door swung inward, revealing a flight of stone steps descending into utter blackness. A blast of frigid, metallic-smelling air hit me. It smelled of rust and something else, something cloying and sweet like old, dried flowers. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, the beam cutting a weak swat through the gloom. The steps were uneven, slick with condensation. At the bottom, a vast, echoing space materialized, the boiler room, no radio contact. Massive, rusted iron pipes snaked across the ceiling and walls like petrified serpents. The air here was thick, heavy, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible hum that mirrored the one I'd felt in my studio. My phone signal was indeed dead. Just as the attorney had warned, this house was a black hole for modern conveniences. In the far corner, half obscured by a tangle of defunct machinery, something glinted. A small porcelain sheen. My breath hitched. It couldn't be, could it? The way the air grew thick like old velvet. I knew that house. I knew the way the shadows clung to its corners, the way the air grew thick like old velvet, pressing down on everything. The call had been a summons, and now, 3 days later, the asphalt ribbon of the state highway unspooled beneath my tires, leading me inevitably back to Blackwood Manor. The drive itself was a blur of roadside greens and grays, my mind a tightly wound spring. Each mile closer, the air in the car seemed to grow colder, the silence heavier. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to acknowledge the knot tightening in my gut. My hands gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight, a desperate attempt to anchor myself in the present to the solid reality of the road. When the rusted, wrought-iron gates finally loomed into view, I felt a tremor run through the car's frame, or perhaps it was just my own body reacting. The gate was a jagged, toothy grin against the overcast sky, its paint long peeled, exposing the pitted iron beneath. It hung slightly ajar, as if impatient for my arrival, or perhaps as if something had just passed through. The only sound was the faint rustle of dry leaves in the overgrown wilderness that was once a manicured garden. I pushed the heavy gate open further, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound like a forgotten beast stirring. The gravel driveway crunched under my boots, a symphony of tiny, brittle bones. The house itself sat at the end of the long, winding path, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky. Its Victorian grandeur was long gone, replaced by a decaying majesty. Turrets clawed at the clouds, their slate shingles fragmented. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something metallic like old pennies, overlaid with a faint, cloying sweetness. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached the massive oak front door. It felt less like an entrance and more like an open maw. I pushed the door inward, and it swung silently, revealing a cavern of gloom. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the accumulated dust of years. It tasted of forgotten things, of mildew and mothballs, but also that strange, metallic sweetness I'd noticed outside. Light filtered weakly through the stained glass panels above the door, painting the dust motes dancing in the air with muted somber colors. I moved through the house, my determined stride a facade over the growing unease. Each room was a tableau of arrested decay. Dust sheets draped over furniture like shrouds, their outlines hinting at the ornate chairs and tables beneath. A grandfather clock in the main hall had stopped at 3:15, its pendulum frozen. I ran a hand over a dusty console table, leaving a clean streak. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of the house settling or perhaps something else shifting in the quiet. I found a child's rocking horse, surprisingly free of dust, tucked away in a corner of the drawing room, its painted eyes staring blankly. It wasn't Leela, but it was a child's toy, and it made my skin prickle. I needed to check the utilities. The boiler room. A narrow wooden door, unpainted and heavily scarred, stood slightly ajar at the far end. Beyond it, a flight of rough-hewn steps descended into absolute blackness. I flipped on my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting a weak swat through the gloom. The steps creaked under my weight, a protesting groan. At the bottom, the beam revealed the boiler room, a cramped, low-ceilinged space. The massive iron boiler dominated the room, a hulking, rusted beast with a gaping, soot-stained maw. Pipes snaked along the walls like metallic vines, dripping condensation onto the damp concrete floor. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of age and neglect. I was utterly alone down here. I walked around the boiler, my flashlight beam dancing over its pitted surface. There was a small wooden shelf built into the wall beside it, holding a few rusted tools and a single small, tarnished silver locket. It was open, empty. Who would leave a locket in a boiler room? A faint scratching sound echoed from behind the boiler, a soft, insistent scrape that seemed to come from within the metal itself, like something trying to get out or in. My breath hitched. The asphalt ribbon unspooled beneath my tires, each mile a tightening knot in my gut. The landscape blurred into a dull green and gray, a fitting prelude to the place I was heading. I remembered the estate agent's voice, a slick, practiced drone, trying to paint the inheritance as a gift, but I knew the truth the moment the words left the receiver's mouth. This wasn't a windfall, it was a sentence. The wrought iron gates, rusted into grotesque skeletal arches, loomed first. They groaned on their hinges as I pushed them inward, the sound like a tortured intake of breath. The driveway, once meticulously graveled, was now a choked path of weeds and cracked flagstones, winding through skeletal oak trees that clawed at the overcast sky. And then there it was, the house, my grandmother's house. A hulking Victorian monstrosity, its gables like sharp teeth, its windows like vacant, staring eyes. The paint peeled in strips resembling flayed skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. It didn't look like a place to live. It looked like a tomb that had forgotten to properly close. I killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. The air outside was cold, carrying the damp scent of decay and wet earth. This was it. No turning back. I gripped the heavy brass key in my hand, its cold metal a small comfort against the tremor in my fingers. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grimy stained glass panels, swirling like agitated spirits. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying the faint, cloying scent of potpourri and something else. Something metallic and old, like forgotten blood. Each sound magnified, each creak of the ancient timber a whisper in the gloom. I moved through the parlor, past shrouded furniture that resembled sleeping giants, into the formal dining room, the long table still set with tarnished silver, a macabre tableau frozen in time. I knew what I was looking for. I had to find it. I had to confront it. My grandmother had been a collector, a hoarder of forgotten things. I started in the attic, the highest point, a vast, cavernous space under the eaves. Trunks overflowed with yellowed lace, hatboxes held feathers long since lost their plume, and stacks of books leaned precariously, their pages brittle with age. I sifted through the detritus, my hands growing grimy with dust and the grit of time. Nothing, not yet. Hours passed. My determination warred with a growing sense of unease. The house felt alive around me, watching, waiting. Finally, I found myself in the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a descent into deeper memory. My flashlight beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing cobweb-draped shelves filled with forgotten jars, tools, and the skeletal remains of old furniture. And then at the very back, behind a precarious stack of old coal scuttles, I saw the door. It was made of thick, splintered wood, bound with iron bands, and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I knew it. It groaned, protesting, but gave way. The room beyond was small, claustrophobic. The air was thick with the metallic tang of old iron and the faint, sweet scent of decay. This was the boiler room, no radio contact. The massive cast-iron boiler sat squat and silent in the center, a dormant beast. My breath hitched. The canvas was familiar, a faded floral pattern I remembered from my grandmother's old sewing room. I pulled, slowly, deliberately. There it was, nestled inside the crate. Nestled amongst a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings and dried flowers was Leela. He was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps my memory had inflated her to monstrous proportions. Her porcelain face, still unnervingly pristine, stared up at me with wide, unblinking blue eyes. Her painted smile, a thin crimson line, seemed to widen in the dim light. Her blonde ringlets, though dusty, were still perfectly coiffed, framing a face that was both angelic and utterly terrifying. One tiny hand, its fingers delicately sculpted, lay resting on a faded silk dress, the other curled into a fist. A gasp escaped me, a choked, raw sound. My stomach churned. The air in my lungs felt suddenly thin, as if the room had sucked it all away. My vision swam. A child's scream, lost and terrified, echoed in the silent chambers of my skull. My own scream. He was real. He was here. The years had not dulled her malevolence, only deepened it. My deepest anxieties, the ones I'd buried under layers of art and ambition, clawed their way to the surface, sharp and undeniable. Leela was not a figment of a child's overactive imagination. He was a living, breathing, malevolent force, and he was smiling. What did she want with me now? The gravel crunched under the tires, a sound like grinding teeth, as I pulled the sedan through the rusted gates. My grandmother's Victorian mansion loomed, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky, its gables sharp as broken bones. The estate agent had called it a property with character, a euphemism for a house that had been left to rot, festering in its own history. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was a weight pressing down, amplifying the wind's mournful sigh through the skeletal trees. No slick, practiced drone here, only the cold, unyielding truth of the place. I stepped out, the air immediately colder than it had any right to be. The porch creaked beneath my weight as I climbed the steps, each groan a complaint from the old house. The front door, a massive slab of oak, was unlocked just as the solicitor had promised. My breath hitched. The air inside was stagnant, heavy, tasting of mildew and something metallic, like old pennies. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows, swirling like tiny, desperate spirits. I fumbled for the light switch. Nothing. The power was out, or perhaps just the main breaker tripped. Of course it was. This place wouldn't make anything easy. I pulled my phone from my pocket, its flashlight beam a fragile spear against the encroaching gloom. The beam cut across an ornate grandfather clock, its hands frozen at 3:15. Always 3:15. I found my way to the kitchen first, a space where light fixtures dangled uselessly from the ceiling. A quick check of the fuse box, a few flicked switches, and with a hesitant hum the house awoke. I tried to focus on practicalities. I told myself it was just the poor lighting, the stress of the journey, the inherent creepiness of an old, abandoned house. Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, like tiny claws dragging across a wooden floor. It seemed to come from upstairs, from the direction of the master bedroom, my grandmother's room. My gut tightened. I froze, listening. I shook my head, blaming the old pipes, the creaking timbers. This house was a symphony of old house noises. I was just hyper-alert, looking for trouble where there was none. I moved to the living room, a space crammed with shrouded furniture, like an audience of ghosts waiting for a performance. As I pulled a sheet from a dusty armchair, a flash of movement caught my eye. My breath caught. I spun, my heart racing. Just the curtain, swaying gently in the disturbed. I stared at it, my eyes straining, trying to pierce the gloom behind the heavy fabric. Was it a mouse? A trick of the light? The scratching started again, closer this time, and unmistakably from the floor above. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, deliberate scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. It sounded like something being dragged. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my phone. I needed to investigate, to prove to myself that it was nothing, just a loose floorboard or a branch tapping against a window. But my feet felt glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to leave this place and never look back. The air grew heavy, thick with that cloying, sweet scent again, stronger now, as if whatever was causing it had just passed by. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I had to know. I had to confront whatever was making these noises, or I would never sleep in this house. The scratching ceased abruptly. A sudden, profound silence descended, more unsettling than the noise itself. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Then a soft, almost inaudible giggle drifted down from upstairs. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real, I knew it, and it was coming from the room where she was. I took a shaky breath. The boiler. The house felt like an icebox despite the power being on. The boiler room was in the basement, a place I hadn't ventured yet, a place the estate agent had specifically warned me about for its temperamental nature. It was an excuse, I knew. They didn't want anyone going down there. My flashlight beam danced ahead of me as I descended the creaking cellar stairs. The walls were rough-hewn stone, sweating with moisture. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten things, broken furniture, dusty crates, and cobweb-draped machinery. I found the door to the boiler room, no radio contact tucked away in a dimly lit corner. The sign, stenciled crudely on the corroded metal door, seemed less like a warning and more like a pronouncement. I pushed the door open. The boiler room was a cramped space, dominated by a monstrous ancient boiler, its pipes a tangle of rusted veins. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of old iron and the faint, acrid smell of burnt dust. My phone, which had been buzzing with notifications upstairs, was now dead silent. I checked the screen, no service. The boiler room, no radio contact was true. I was completely cut off. As I stepped further in, a low hum started from the boiler, a deep vibration that resonated in my chest. The hum intensified, growing into a rhythmic thrumming like a colossal heart beating beneath the floor. It glided across the concrete floor, stopping at my feet. I stood frozen, my breath fogging in the frigid air, unable to move, unable to scream. My eyes were wide, fixed on the spot where it had been. Then I saw it. Tucked into a crevice in the concrete floor, half hidden by a loose pipe, was a small, crudely drawn stick figure. And next to it, partially obscured, was a tiny, perfect footprint, barely an inch long, pressed into the dust. My heart hammered. Was it just a child who had played down here decades ago? Or was this something new, something she had left for me? The estate agent had called it a property with character. I had cut her off, the euphemism too thin to hide the truth. This place was a mausoleum. A sigh heavy with dust and resignation escaped me as I killed the engine. The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with the weight of decades. I stepped out, the air sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old like forgotten blood. The front door, a slab of scarred oak, groaned open as if protesting my intrusion. Inside, the grand foyer swallowed the last slivers of twilight, leaving only the dim, watery light filtering through grimy stained glass panels. My breath plumed. I needed a space to work, to anchor myself. My art had always been my refuge, a way to translate the chaos in my head into something tangible, something I could control. I found a vast, unused ballroom on the second floor, its tarnished mirrors reflecting distorted versions of the flickering flashlight beam. Dust motes danced in the sparse light like tiny, frantic spirits. This would be my studio. The air in the room felt thick, like old velvet pressing down. I wiped down a stretch of floor, set up my easel. My hands, calloused and paint-stained, moved with a practiced rhythm, a desperate attempt at normalcy. I squeezed a tube of cadmium red onto my palette, then a dollop of ivory black. I wanted to paint the stark beauty of the winter trees outside, their skeletal branches reaching, yearning, but my brush hesitated. It hovered over the canvas, heavy, unwilling. I tried to focus, to find the line, the curve, the texture of the bark. Instead, my mind drifted, pulled by an unseen current towards something else. A flicker in my peripheral vision, a movement in the deepest corner of the room near the draped windows. Just the wind, I told myself, rattling a loose pane, but the air was still. I shook my head, dipped the brush. My hand, usually so steady, trembled. The first stroke was not the elegant line I intended, but a jagged, splintered mark like a shard of broken glass. I tried again, forcing my will onto the bristles, but the image forming on the canvas was not the graceful tree. It was a face. A child's face, but wrong. The eyes were too wide, too vacant, the mouth a thin, cruel line. I frowned, wiped it away with a rag. What was I doing? The days blurred into a cycle of restless sleep and feverish creation. I worked relentlessly, driven by an urgency I couldn't explain. The studio became my world, the canvas my confessional. I stopped trying to paint the trees. The faces kept coming. Not human faces, not quite. They were smoother, harder, like carved wood or porcelain. Their expressions were fixed, unblinking, yet imbued with a profound, unsettling malice. My palette shifted too. I found myself sketching intricate patterns of splintered wood, jagged seams, and tiny, delicate hinges. My fingers ached, my eyes burned, but I couldn't stop. It felt less like creation and more like transcription. One afternoon, a specific shade of ochre I needed ran out. It was a peculiar, almost jaundiced yellow, vital for the pallor I was now obsessed with capturing. I remembered seeing a dusty tin of old pigments in the mansion's deepest recesses. The air grew heavy, damp, smelling of rust and coal dust. Pipes snaked overhead like skeletal veins. I pushed open a warped wooden door, its hinges screaming. I had found the boiler room, no radio contact. The air in the boiler room was thick and close, a humid breath from the earth itself. It felt ancient, like a dormant heart. Every sound I made echoed, swallowed by the thick walls, leaving only the frantic rhythm of my own pulse in my ears. It wasn't empty. It was full of something I couldn't name. I fumbled through cobwebbed shelves, my breath clouding. The small metal tin of pigment was there, nestled amongst forgotten wrenches and corroded valves. As I grabbed it, my fingers brushed against something else, a small wooden shard, intricately carved like a fragment of a doll's arm. I dropped it, a sharp clatter against the concrete floor. My skin prickled. Had it been there at all? Back in the studio, the ochre pigment was exactly right. It brought a ghastly realism to the doll-like figures that now dominated my canvases. They were no longer just faces. They were full figures, often in poses of forced innocence or silent torment. A small wooden rocking horse had eyes that followed me, and always at the periphery or sometimes at the very center was her. Not explicitly Leela, but an undeniable presence. I saw memories I had long suppressed, scenes from my childhood but filtered through a lens of undeniable malice. My own small hand reaching for a toy, the silhouette of a doll too tall, too still in a doorway. My art was no longer my own. My hand moved with a strange autonomy, guided by an unseen force. I was merely an instrument, a conduit. The brushstrokes weren't mine, they were hers. The colors bled into each other, forming shapes that were both familiar and monstrous. The doll's eyes, rendered with that specific, jaundiced ochre, seemed to bore into me, into my eyes. And on the child's arm, a tiny, almost imperceptible detail, a small, faded scar exactly like the one I carried from that long-ago fall. I dropped the brush, its bristles clattering against the polished floorboards. The painting stared back at me, a silent accusation. It wasn't just a reflection of my trauma. It was a testament to her power, her enduring presence. What other truths was she forcing me to confront? The estate agent had called it a property with character, a phrase that now tasted like dust and rust on my tongue. The mansion did possess character, all right, the kind that clawed at my throat and whispered forgotten secrets in the dead of night. I stepped out of the sedan, the gravel protesting under my boots, each crunch a tiny, desperate shriek. The air was thick and cold, even though the sun had only just begun its reluctant descent. It felt heavier here, inside the perimeter of the wrought iron fence, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak, groaned open at my touch, a sound I knew too well. It wasn't the welcoming creak of a familiar home, it was the sigh of a sleeping beast disturbed. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, each particle a tiny, fleeting ghost. I walked through the silent halls, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. I wasn't here to simply inherit. I was here to understand, to dismantle the monstrous legacy my grandmother had left behind. Leela. Her name was a jagged shard of glass in my mind. I needed to know everything, where she came from, why he was here, and what part my grandmother truly played in all of it. Dean, I told myself, I am determined. This time, I wouldn't run. My grandmother had always been a woman of secrets, her life a labyrinth of locked doors and hushed conversations. I knew her habits, her hiding places. She'd always found solace in the forgotten corners of the house, places where the world couldn't reach her. The study was too obvious, the attic too exposed. No, her deepest secrets would be kept where no one would think to look, where the house itself seemed to breathe its last. I began my search in the library, a vast chamber lined with ancient tomes that smelled of parchment and despair. Nothing. I moved to the drawing room where faded tapestries depicted scenes of pastoral innocence that felt profoundly wrong in this setting. Still nothing. My frustration grew, a hot ember in my gut. Then I remembered the cellar. My grandmother had always claimed it was off-limits, her eyes wide and unblinking whenever the topic arose. A perfect hiding spot. I found the cellar door tucked away behind a pantry in the kitchen, almost entirely obscured by shelves of dusty, forgotten preserves. It was a heavy wooden door, black with age, secured by a rusty padlock. I stared at it, the metal glinting faintly in the dim light. My grandmother was meticulous. She wouldn't have left the key lying around. I searched the kitchen, my movements quick and desperate. The key. It was heavy, ornate, and fit the lock perfectly. With a sharp click, the padlock sprang open. I descended the rickety wooden steps, each creak a complaint from the house itself. The steps ended on a dirt floor, uneven and soft under my feet. Ahead, a narrow, low-ceilinged passage stretched into the black. The passage opened into a larger, cavernous space. This was it, the boiler room, no radio contact. The air here was a suffocating mix of heat, dampness, and the metallic tang of old iron. A massive, ancient boiler dominated the center of the room, its black iron skin flaking with rust. Pipes snaked across the ceiling and walls like monstrous veins, occasionally dripping condensation onto the dirt floor with a soft plink. The boiler itself hummed, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through the very soles of my feet. It was a sound that felt less mechanical and more like a living thing breathing, struggling. The heat was stifling, clinging to my skin, making my shirt stick to my back. I swept the flashlight beam across the room. There were shelves against one wall, laden with tools, empty paint cans, and what looked like old lumber. But in a small, recessed alcove, almost hidden behind a stack of firewood, I saw it. A wooden chest, bound with tarnished brass, sitting on a small, makeshift table. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the humid air. I approached the chest, my hand trembling as I reached for the latch. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, and the smell of aged paper and dried roses wafted out. There were also photographs, faded and sepia-toned, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. I pulled out the first journal, its pages brittle. The entries were dated, starting years before I was born. My grandmother's thoughts, her anxieties, her desperate hopes. She wrote of loneliness, of a desperate need for connection, of a growing fascination with old folklore and forgotten crafts. Then I found the entry that mentioned Leela, not as a doll, but as an idea, a concept. My grandmother had been researching ancient practices, obscure rituals involving effigies and transference, by something she didn't explicitly name. The details were vague, fragmented, but the intent was horrifyingly clear. She wasn't just acquiring a doll, he was birthing something. I flipped through more pages, my eyes darting, hungry for the truth. Life, and my grandmother in her grief or her madness had commissioned him. He had given him the blueprint for Leela, not just the physical form, but the purpose. Then I found it, an entry dated to the year of my 7th birthday. My grandmother's hand was shaky, the ink smeared in places. She watches him, always watches. Dean, my beautiful boy, I thought. I thought he would be a comfort, a protector, but she hungers. She feeds. Today the cat, gone, and his dreams. He screams at night. I hear her laughter. It's not a child's laugh. It's a dry, brittle sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. I saw her eyes. They are not glass. They are bottomless. And Dean. He drew a picture today. He said she told him stories. The cat. My childhood cat Whiskers. I'd always been told he ran away, not gone, not fed, and the dreams, the specific event. It wasn't just a general trauma. It was a slow, insidious invasion, starting with my dreams, my familiar pet, my very perception of reality. Leela hadn't just been a creepy doll. She'd been an active, malevolent presence orchestrated by my own grandmother. My grandmother hadn't been protecting me from Leela. He had been protecting Leela from me, or perhaps protecting herself from what he had unleashed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. A sudden, sharp clang echoed through the boiler room, making me jump. The sound came from the boiler itself, a metallic shriek that seemed to vibrate with a malignant energy. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The low hum of the boiler intensified, rising in pitch, a desperate rising keen. The flashlight beam flickered, then dimmed, threatening to die. Was she still here? There was Leela in this room, watching me read her origin story. And what had my grandmother truly intended for me, her grandson, when she brought such a thing into our home? My breath hitched. The cat, Whiskers. The name echoed in the vast, hollow chambers of my mind, a phantom purr against the silence. Not gone, not fed. The words the old woman had whispered, the dreams, the whispers, the specific event. Leela. He had always been there, a silent observer, a puppeteer pulling threads I hadn't seen. But now the strings were taut, visible, and I was the marionette. I had to get out. That was the only thought that pierced through the buzzing in my ears. My feet, heavy and reluctant, shuffled towards the grand front doors, the ones I'd entered through only days ago, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and morbid curiosity. Now only desperation spurred me on. Each step on the worn Persian rug felt like wading through treacle. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with potpourri. It was a smell I remembered, though I couldn't place it, a scent that clung to the edges of my earliest, most fractured memories. My fingers grazed the metal, but before I could grip it, a faint, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the wood. The ornate carving seemed to writhe, the grain blurring, stretching. The doors themselves appeared to elongate, growing taller, wider, until they filled my entire field of vision, impossibly vast, utterly impassable. This wasn't right. I blinked, rubbed my eyes hard. When I opened them, the doors were still impossibly large, the brass handle now a distant, unreachable speck. Panic began to claw at my throat. I spun around, searching for a different exit, a window, anything. The grand foyer had changed. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy. No signal. Of course. I tried the landline on the small side table nearby, lifting the heavy receiver. Dead. A flat, empty hum. The wallpaper felt damp, almost slick. I pushed off, my heart racing, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I had to find another way, the kitchen. There was a back door in the kitchen. I remembered it clearly from my first walkthrough. I pushed past the phantom wall where the staircase had been, forcing myself through the narrow, shifting archway. I pulled my arms tight across my chest, shivering, but pushed on. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a symphony of decay that seemed to mock my every move. I called out, my voice hoarse, "Hello? My cat, my cat." I walked, and the hallway only continued. The portraits on the walls, once stern and imposing, now seemed to twist, their painted eyes following me, their lips curled into silent, knowing smiles. I whirled, but there was nothing, only the swaying fabric and the deepening gloom. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs ached. This wasn't the house I'd inherited, this was a labyrinth, a living, breathing entity designed to consume. Finally, a door. It wasn't the kitchen door I remembered, but a heavy, unpainted slab of wood tucked away at the end of the impossibly long corridor. It looked old, forgotten, scarred with deep gouges. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the wood. This felt wrong, but it was a door, an exit of some kind. Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, flickered within me. I reached for the iron latch, my hand shaking. It grated loudly as I lifted it, the sound echoing down the hallway like a scream. I pushed the door inward. A blast of hot, stagnant air hit me, smelling of burnt oil and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet like decaying flowers. I stepped inside, my feet finding uneven concrete. I was in the boiler room. No radio contact. The air was thick, suffocating. The heat pressed in on me, making my skin prickle with sweat. I could hear a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to travel up through the soles of my shoes, through my bones, shaking my teeth. It was the sound of the old boiler, dormant for decades, now stirring to life. My eyes, adjusting to the gloom, made out the hulking mass of the ancient machine, a rusted iron leviathan squatting in the center of the room. Pipes, thick as my arm, snaked across the ceiling, dripping intermittently, the drops hissing as they hit the hot metal. I pulled my phone out again, a futile gesture, but I had to try. Nothing. The screen was blank, no bars, no signal, just the empty, dead weight in my hand, trapped. The word resonated with the hum of the boiler. I was trapped. Then I saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of old, grimy pipes, half hidden by a mound of coal dust, was a small, matted clump of fur. It was gray, streaked with brown, and beneath it, a tiny, brittle bone gnawed clean. My stomach lurched. It was Whiskers. It had to be not a dream, not a memory. This was real. This was the truth. Leela hadn't just taken him, he had kept him. He had fed him. It clicked into place with sickening clarity. He had manipulated everything, from the moment I arrived, perhaps even before. My childhood memories weren't just suppressed trauma. They were carefully curated illusions, shielding me from the monstrous truth of her influence. I had never truly left her. A high-pitched, childish giggle echoed from the far corner of the boiler room, bouncing off the rusted walls. The hum of the boiler intensified, a deep, guttural growl. The air grew hotter, stifling. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my forehead. But then I saw it again, a flicker of movement, just for a second. A flash of pale blue eyes. Fixed on me, he was here with me, and she wasn't just manipulating the house. He was here watching me, delighting in my fear. The door I'd entered through was gone, seamlessly merged with the rough concrete wall. There was no latch, no handle, no seam. Just a solid, unyielding barrier. How had I gotten in? How would I get out? The hallway stretched, a mocking ribbon of faded wallpaper and dusty floorboards. Every step I took seemed to echo not just behind me, but ahead, as if the space itself was playing a cruel trick. The portraits, those painted ancestors, their eyes now truly seemed to track my movement, the corners of their mouths twitching into silent, knowing smiles. My breath hitched. That shadow. It darted again, a quick ink-black smear against the heavy velvet curtain, gone before my eyes could properly focus. It wasn't just a trick of the light this time. I felt it, a cold ripple across my skin, like a spider skittering up my arm. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something acrid, metallic like rust. It pulled me, a magnetic force, dragging my feet forward even as every instinct screamed to turn and run. The hallway narrowed, the opulent decor stripped away, replaced by rough-hewn walls and exposed pipes dripping condensation. The light, already dim, became a sickly yellow glow, cast by bare bulbs caged in wire. I pushed through a heavy, unmarked door, the metal groaning on its hinges, and stepped into the boiler room, no radio contact. The air here was scalding, humid, thick with the scent of hot metal, steam, and something else, something cloying and sweet like dried blood mixed with old roses. Towering iron boilers, their sides scarred with rust, dominated the space, hissing and groaning with a life of their own. Pipes crisscrossed the ceiling, dripping intermittently, each drop sizzling on the hot floor. The thrumming was deafening now, a visceral pulse that shook the very ground beneath my feet. My shirt clung to my back, already soaked. And there he was, Leela. She sat on a low, overturned crate in the center of the room, directly in front of the largest boiler. Her porcelain face, usually so placid, seemed to gleam in the dim, sweaty light. Her eyes, those unsettling glass eyes, were fixed on me. She wasn't moving, not a muscle, but the entire room felt alive with her presence, thrumming with her malevolent energy. The heat intensified, searing my lungs with every ragged breath. It wasn't Leela's voice, not really. It was my own, twisted, distorted, echoing from every corner of the room. It was the voice of doubt, of fear. You always come back. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. I could feel the tremor in my knees, but I fought it. I had to. I remembered the brittle pages of my grandmother's journal, the frantic, looping script. She feeds on the recollection. She twists the threads of what was true, consumes the fear of what might be. That was it. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the image seared itself into my mind. You're nothing without my memories, I forced out, stepping forward, one slow, deliberate foot after the other. Each one was perfectly recreated, designed to prick at old wounds, to shatter my resolve. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, pushing through the auditory assault. This was her game. This was how she fed. When I opened them again, the room had shifted. The boilers were gone, replaced by the familiar, dusty attic of my childhood home. The crate Leela sat on was now a small, child-sized rocking chair, and the doll herself seemed larger, her eyes wide, expectant. She held a tiny, tarnished music box. I knew that music box. This was the moment. This was the trap. She wanted me to relive it, to drown in the shame and the fear, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. I focused on the heat, the smell of rust, the metallic tang in my mouth. These were real, not now. You feed on lies, I said, my voice gaining strength, cutting through the illusion. I pointed a trembling finger at her. You take what's broken and you shatter it further, but I remember the truth now. Leela remained, but the serene porcelain mask was gone. Her face seemed to ripple, the painted features stretching, contorting into something truly monstrous, a silent scream frozen in ceramic. The small, skeletal hand I'd glimpsed before was now visible, clutching the back of her head, its bony fingers digging into the doll's neck. This wasn't just a doll. It was a prison, a vessel. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the room, not from the boilers, but from somewhere deeper, something ancient and enraged. It was the sound of a predator denied its prey. Leela's head snapped to the side, her glass eyes now burning with a raw, furious light. The grip of the skeletal hand tightened, and a thin, spiderweb crack appeared on Leela's perfect cheek, spreading like a venomous vine. I had struck a nerve. I had seen past the illusion, past the porcelain. But what was I truly fighting? The room flickered again, the attic dissolving, replaced by the oppressive reality of the boiler room, no radio contact. My breath hitched, a raw, ragged sound in the suffocating heat. The stench of stale oil and something metallic like old blood clawed at the back of my throat. My vision swam, the edges of the room blurring, but Leela remained horrifyingly sharp, her distorted face a gaping maw of ceramic dread. This wasn't a trick of the mind, not anymore. This was the truth. This was her, and he was real. I wouldn't run, not again. My hand, trembling, found the heavy iron poker leaning against the soot-stained bricks of the ancient furnace. Its weight was reassuring, solid. The boiler hummed, a low, guttural growl, a mechanical beast waiting to be fed. The firebox door, a gaping maw itself, radiated a fierce heat. I could feel the searing warmth on my face, even from where I stood. I took a step, then another, the floorboards groaning beneath my worn boots. Leela didn't move, but her ceramic gaze, those stretched, black holes where eyes should have been, seemed to bore into me, into the very core of my fractured being. It was a silent challenge, an ancient, malevolent dare. The air grew impossibly thick, pressing down, making each breath a struggle. My muscles screamed, but I pushed through the pain, through the dizzying waves of nausea. This had to end. Now, with a choked cry, a sound ripped from the deepest part of my chest, I lunged. The poker felt light in my grip, almost weightless as I swung it not at her, but at the stand she rested on. A sickening crack echoed, followed by the clatter of wood and porcelain. Leela tumbled, a grotesque, flailing thing, landing with a sickening thud on the grimy floor. The impact vibrated through the soles of my feet. She lay there face down, unmoving, but I knew with a primal certainty that this was far from over. Was she broken, or just biding her time? I scrambled forward, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the ache in my joints. My fingers, numb with adrenaline, closed around her porcelain arm. It was surprisingly warm, almost feverish, beneath my touch. A jolt like static electricity shot through me, making my teeth clench. I heard a faint, high-pitched whine, almost imperceptible over the boiler's rumble, but it was there, a desperate, fading protest. It seemed to emanate from the doll itself, a sound that twisted my gut. I dragged her, a dead weight, towards the furnace. The heat intensified, scorching the hair on my arms. The metallic smell grew sharper, acrid. Her head still intact rolled unnaturally, those monstrous, stretched features now facing me, silent and accusing. A desperate strength surged through me. With a grunt, I forced open the heavy iron door of the furnace. A blast of infernal heat roared out, smelling of ash and burning metal. The flames inside danced, hungry and orange. This was it. This was the end. I shoved her with all my remaining might, into the fiery maw. She hit the glowing coals with a soft thump. For a moment, nothing, then a faint ping, like a tiny bell, followed by a series of tiny, sharp cracks like ice fracturing. The porcelain, I realized, was shattering in the extreme heat. I slammed the heavy door shut, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly still boiler room. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold them steady. My skin felt raw, my eyes burned. Was it truly gone? Had I finally banished her? Every muscle in my body throbbed, a dull, insistent ache. My throat was raw, my eyes gritty. The image of her contorted face, those stretching features, was burned behind my eyelids. I squeezed them shut, but the image remained. It was almost worse. After what felt like an eternity, I pushed myself up, my legs wobbly beneath me. I walked slowly, hesitantly back to the furnace. The iron door was still searing hot. I gripped the handle, gritting my teeth against the pain, and pulled it open just a crack. Inside, the fire still glowed, but it was dying down, consuming the last of its fuel. All that remained of Leela was a scattered pile of ash and a few iridescent shards, like broken fragments of a shattered mirror, shimmering faintly in the embers. They seemed to pulse with a faint, residual warmth. One shard, no bigger than my thumbnail, lay slightly apart from the rest, catching the light in a peculiar way. It wasn't porcelain, it felt familiar, too familiar. This wasn't just ash, this wasn't just dust. It was a fragment of the truth, a silent testament to the fact that some things once broken can never be fully erased. Had I truly destroyed her, or had I simply fractured her, scattering her essence, perhaps even absorbing a piece of it? The mansion was silent, a profound, heavy quietude that stretched and yawned. The boiler room, no radio contact, felt less like a prison and more like a tomb. I stumbled out, the stale air of the upper floors feeling strangely light, yet still tainted. My reflection in a dusty mirror in the hallway startled me. My face was streaked with soot, my eyes wide and bloodshot, but it was more than that. A tremor ran through me. I reached up, touching my cheek. My fingers brushed against a faint, almost invisible scar, a thin line just below my right eye. I didn't remember getting it. It wasn't a fresh wound. It felt old, ingrained, as if it had always been there, just hidden from view, a mark, a brand. The house no longer felt overtly malicious, but it wasn't empty either. I knew I had survived. I had faced her and I had acted. I had shed a part of myself in that furnace, a piece of my sanity, perhaps, or a sliver of my innocence. The horror was gone, yes, but it had left an indelible mark, a permanent etching on my soul. Could I ever truly escape the echoes of her scream?